Zurich, at the end of the 19th century, was a city that believed deeply in its own civility. Gas lamps lined clean streets. Universities attracted minds from across Europe. Hospitals stood as monuments to progress, their white walls promising relief, order, and scientific certainty. On the surface, everything suggested control, of disease, of the body, of the future itself. But buried beneath that confidence was something far less refined. Something that was never meant to be seen. The object itself was unremarkable at first glance. A small, leather-bound notebook, its edges softened by time, its pages yellowed and brittle. No title on the cover. No author's name inside. Just dense handwriting, tight, deliberate, almost anxious in its precision. At some point, long after the ink had dried and the hand that wrote it was gone, someone realized what it contained. And more importantly, what it should never have contained at all. This was not a diary. There were no personal reflections, no confessions of love or grief. What filled these pages were observations, clinical, methodical, stripped of emotion. Dates, measurements, reactions, failures, occasional corrections scratched out and rewritten, as if the truth itself were being adjusted. Human beings appeared only as numbers, initials, or vague descriptors. Female, 23, male subject, refractory, child, congenital weakness. There were no names. There was no sympathy. Only outcomes. To understand why this notebook feels so disturbing even now, more than a century later, you have to understand what it represented in its time. In 1899, medicine stood on the edge of transformation. Germ theory had begun to replace superstition. Psychiatry was emerging as a formal discipline. The brain was no longer a mystery left to philosophers alone. It was becoming a site of experimentation. Doctors were celebrated not just as healers, but as pioneers. And pioneers, history tells us, are often forgiven for what they destroy along the way. The notebook belonged to this moment. Every page radiated urgency, as if the writer believed they were racing against something: ignorance, institutional limits, perhaps even their own conscience. Procedures were described with a casual confidence that feels chilling today. Interventions were attempted, modified, repeated. When subjects deteriorated, the language did not change. When they failed to recover, the tone remained flat. When they died, the entry simply moved on. What makes the notebook truly unsettling is not just what it describes, but what it omits. There is no mention of consent. No indication that those being observed understood what was being done to them. No trace of doubt, no written hesitation. And yet, the very existence of the notebook suggests secrecy. This was not an official hospital ledger. It was not formatted for publication. It reads like something written for one pair of eyes only, or perhaps for no eyes at all beyond the author's. That raises the question that haunts every page. If these notes were never meant to be read, why were they written so carefully? Why preserve details so meticulously if there was no intention of sharing them? The answer may lie in the mindset of late 19th century science, where documentation itself was an act of power. To record was to claim authority. To measure suffering was to transform it into data. And data, once collected, could always be justified later. Zurich was an ideal place for such a notebook to exist. It was a city that prided itself on rationality and order, but also one that quietly tolerated rigid social hierarchies. The poor, the mentally ill, women who defied expectations, children born with disabilities, all existed on the margins of respectability. They were visible enough to be studied, but invisible enough to be sacrificed. Medical institutions relied on this imbalance. Without it, many advances of the era would not have been possible. As the notebook progresses, a pattern begins to emerge. Certain types of subjects appear again and again. Those deemed uncooperative. Those described as morally unstable. Those whose family histories were labeled defective. These were not random patients. They were selected. And that selection reveals an unspoken logic. Some lives were considered less valuable than the knowledge that could be extracted from them. There is an eerie calmness to the writing, a sense that the author felt justified, perhaps even virtuous. This was, after all, the age of progress. Pain could be reframed as necessity. Failure could be blamed on the subject rather than the method. The notebook does not scream with cruelty. It whispers with certainty. And that is far more frightening. At some point, the entries stop. Not gradually, but abruptly. No conclusion. No summary. No final reflection. Just empty pages. Whatever happened, whether the author abandoned the work, was stopped, or simply ran out of subjects, remains unknown. The silence at the end feels intentional, as if the notebook itself knew it had gone too far. For decades, it remained hidden, tucked away among archives, misfiled, ignored, or deliberately overlooked. Institutions that thrived on reputation had little incentive to draw attention to documents like this. A single notebook could raise uncomfortable questions, not just about one doctor, but about an entire system that enabled them. Silence was easier. Forgetting was safer. Yet forgetting was never complete. Ink, once set to paper, has a way of surviving intentions. Long after the people involved were gone, long after the wards were renovated and the practices officially condemned, the notebook remained. Waiting. Today, reading it feels like trespassing. There is a sense that you are seeing something forbidden, something that violates an unspoken boundary between past and present. These pages were not written for us. They were written in a time when suffering could be rationalized, when authority went largely unquestioned, and when morality bent easily beneath the weight of ambition. This is not just the story of a notebook. It is the story of what happens when knowledge outruns ethics, when curiosity is no longer restrained by empathy, when the desire to understand the human body eclipses respect for the human being inside it. The notebook was never meant to be read, but now that it has been, it forces a reckoning, not only with the darkness of the past, but with the uncomfortable truth that progress has always carried shadows with it. And sometimes, those shadows are carefully recorded, line by line, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to look. By the final years of the 19th century, Zurich had positioned itself as one of Europe's most confident cities of progress. To outsiders, it appeared calm, orderly, and almost self-satisfied in its intellectual maturity. The streets were clean, the institutions well-funded, and the city's universities attracted physicians, philosophers, and scientists eager to shape the future. Yet beneath this polished surface was a rigid social structure that determined who benefited from progress, and who quietly paid for it. Medicine in 1899 was no longer guided solely by tradition or superstition. Laboratories were replacing prayer. Measurement was replacing intuition. Zurich's medical schools were deeply invested in the belief that the human body could be fully understood if it were only observed closely enough. Disease was no longer seen as an act of God but as a mechanical failure, something that could be isolated, catalogued, and corrected. This shift brought genuine breakthroughs, but it also encouraged a dangerous sense of entitlement. If the body was a machine, then patients could become components. And broken components, by definition, could be tested. Hospitals in Zurich were not merely places of healing, they were sites of research. Young doctors were trained not just to treat, but to investigate. Every unusual symptom was a potential discovery. Every abnormal behavior hinted at an underlying biological cause. Psychiatry, still in its infancy, was particularly fertile ground for experimentation. Mental illness frightened society because it resisted easy explanations. Those who suffered from it challenged the ideal of rational, disciplined citizenship that Swiss culture prized so deeply. The prevailing medical mindset of the time was obsessed with classification. Patients were sorted into categories that often blurred moral judgment with diagnosis. A woman who defied social norms could be labeled hysterical. A man who committed a crime might be described as biologically predisposed to violence. Children who failed to develop normally were often seen not as individuals, but as evidence of hereditary failure. These labels carried immense weight. Once assigned, they followed a person everywhere, into hospitals, asylums, and often into permanent confinement. Zurich's scientific community did not exist in isolation. Across Europe, influential thinkers were promoting theories of degeneration and hereditary decline. There was a growing fear that modern society, rather than improving humanity, was weakening it. Urbanization, industrial labor, and social change were blamed for producing fragile minds and bodies. Medicine responded not with compassion, but with scrutiny. The question was no longer how to care for the vulnerable, but how to identify and control them. This environment created a sharp divide between those considered valuable contributors to society and those seen as burdens. Middle and upper-class patients received discretion, privacy, and careful treatment. Their ailments were addressed with caution, their reputations protected. The poor, the institutionalized, and the socially marginal enjoyed no such safeguards. They were visible to doctors but invisible to the public. Their suffering occurred behind closed doors, shielded by medical authority. The legal framework of the time reinforced this imbalance. Consent, as it is understood today, was poorly defined. Physicians were trusted implicitly, their decisions rarely questioned by patients or families. In cases involving mental illness or institutionalized individuals, consent was often assumed or ignored entirely. The doctor's judgment was considered sufficient justification. This created an environment where experimentation could flourish without oversight, especially when outcomes could be framed as necessary sacrifices for knowledge. Zurich's reputation for order also meant that dissent was subtle. There were critics of medical excess, but they tended to speak cautiously, aware of professional and social consequences. To openly challenge respected institutions was to risk isolation. As a result, ethical concerns were often discussed privately, if at all. Publicly, the narrative remained one of progress and benevolence. Privately, boundaries were being tested. Within hospitals, hierarchies were rigid. Senior physicians wielded immense power, and their theories shaped the practices of those beneath them. Junior doctors were expected to prove themselves through diligence and innovation. Success was measured in publications, discoveries, and recognition. Failure meant obscurity. In such an environment, ethical hesitation could be seen as weakness. Ambition, when rewarded consistently, rarely stops to question itself. The city's cultural values further complicated matters. Swiss society placed great emphasis on discipline, productivity, and conformity. Those who failed to meet these ideals were often viewed with suspicion. Medicine absorbed these values, translating social deviance into pathology. Treatment became a means of correction, not just of illness, but of behavior. The line between care and control blurred until it was almost indistinguishable. It is within this context that the notebook must be understood. Its contents did not emerge from madness or cruelty alone. They were the product of a system that quietly encouraged transgression in the name of advancement. A system that taught doctors to see patterns rather than people, outcomes rather than experiences. The notebook reflects a mindset that was not radical at the time, but disturbingly mainstream. The confidence of 1899 Zurich rested on the belief that science would ultimately justify itself, that whatever discomfort or harm occurred along the way would be redeemed by future benefits. This belief insulated practitioners from immediate moral reckoning. Suffering became temporary. Progress was eternal. And as long as discoveries continued, questions could be postponed. Yet there was an unspoken tension beneath this certainty, a sense that something was being lost as knowledge advanced. Some physicians sensed it, even if they lacked the language to articulate it. The notebook's careful secrecy suggests an awareness, however faint, that not everything being done could withstand scrutiny. That some truths, if exposed, might tarnish the image of medicine as a purely noble pursuit. Zurich at the turn of the century was not uniquely cruel, nor uniquely enlightened. It was emblematic of a broader moment in history when science moved faster than ethics, and institutions were unprepared, or unwilling, to slow it down. The city's calm exterior masked a quiet willingness to experiment on those with the least power to resist. This was the world in which the notebook was written. A world where order justified intrusion, where progress excused harm, and where silence protected reputations. Understanding this environment does not absolve what occurred within it, but it explains how such a document could exist without immediate outrage. The notebook was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. There is something deeply unsettling about an author who refuses to identify themselves, especially when the words they leave behind speak with such confidence. The notebook offers no name, no signature, no institutional seal. And yet, everything about it suggests authority. The handwriting is disciplined, consistent, trained. The vocabulary is technical, precise, and unmistakably medical. This was not an amateur recording curiosities. This was someone who belonged inside Zurich's professional elite, someone who moved comfortably within hospital corridors and academic lecture halls. Clues to the author's identity are scattered throughout the pages, though never directly acknowledged. References to ward schedules, access to patients over extended periods, and familiarity with emerging neurological terminology suggest formal training and institutional backing. Certain abbreviations align with internal hospital shorthand used at the time, implying that the writer was not an outsider observing from a distance, but an insider embedded in the system. The notebook reads like an extension of daily work, private notes taken after official records were closed. The choice to remain anonymous feels deliberate. In an era when physicians proudly attach their names to publications and discoveries, anonymity stands out. It suggests awareness of risk. Perhaps the author knew that these observations, if exposed, would provoke criticism or scandal. Or perhaps anonymity served a psychological function, allowing the writer to detach fully from the human consequences of their actions. Without a name, there is no accountability. Only data remains. The tone of the writing is revealing. It is not rushed, nor is it chaotic. Each entry follows a consistent structure: observation, intervention, response, outcome. Even when outcomes are grim, the cadence does not change. There is no visible emotional fluctuation, no trace of hesitation. This emotional flatness is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of discipline. Medical training of the period actively discouraged displays of empathy, equating detachment with professionalism. The Notebook reflects this philosophy in its purest, most disturbing form. Yet beneath the surface, there are moments where the mask slips. Corrections appear in the margins, as if the author reconsidered how much to reveal. Some phrases are crossed out and replaced with softer terminology, hinting at an internal struggle over language rather than action. These small edits suggest that the author was not entirely unaware of the moral ambiguity of their work. They knew how it might be interpreted, even if they chose to proceed regardless. The writer's position within the medical hierarchy can be inferred through subtle details. The Notebook demonstrates access to multiple patients across different categories, implying authority or at least significant autonomy. However, the absence of official formatting and the private nature of the notes suggest someone who is not yet at the top. This may have been a junior physician or researcher, ambitious, eager to prove their value, and willing to push boundaries that more established figures might avoid openly. Ambition often thrives in shadows. There is also a sense of intellectual isolation in the Notebook. Despite operating within a bustling medical community, the author appears to be thinking alone. The Notebook is not written as correspondence, nor as a draft for publication. It feels introspective in its own way, though not reflective. This was a space where the author could think freely, unfiltered by institutional oversight or peer judgment. In that freedom, ethics become optional. The author's worldview becomes clearer as patterns emerge. Patients are not described as individuals with histories and emotions, but as carriers of traits. Heredity is emphasized repeatedly. Family backgrounds are reduced to bullet points. Behavior is interpreted not as response to circumstance, but as evidence of biological defect. This perspective aligns with emerging theories of the time, but the Notebook takes them further, applying them with a certainty that borders on obsession. What is striking is how rarely the author expresses surprise. Unexpected reactions are noted, but not questioned. Failures are recorded without frustration. Successes are not celebrated. Everything is absorbed into the process, as if the writer believed that all outcomes, positive or negative, served the same ultimate purpose: understanding. This suggests a mindset that valued knowledge above all else, even above personal reputation or moral clarity. The absence of personal detail is itself a form of self-portrait. There are no references to family, colleagues, or external events. The world outside the hospital barely exists. This narrow focus implies a life consumed by work, by theory, by the pursuit of explanation. It is possible that the author believed themselves to be serving humanity, even as they dehumanized individuals. History is filled with people who committed harm under the conviction that they were advancing something greater. There is also the possibility that anonymity offered protection not just from others, but from the self. By refusing to name themselves, the author avoided confronting their own identity in relation to their actions. The Notebook becomes a space where responsibility dissolves into observation. The writer does not say, "I did this." They say, "Subject responded." Language does the work of erasure. Speculation about who this person was has persisted since the Notebook's rediscovery. Some historians suggest a connection to known figures in Zurich psychiatric circles, while others argue that the author was deliberately careful to avoid identifiable markers. This ambiguity has only added to the Notebook's power. Without a name, the author becomes symbolic, a representation of a broader class of practitioners who operated within the same moral gray zone. What makes the anonymous author truly unsettling is not that they were uniquely cruel or monstrous, but that they were likely ordinary by the standards of their time. Educated, respected, convinced of their own rationality. The notebook does not read like the work of a sadist. It reads like the work of a professional doing what they believed was necessary. That is precisely why it is so difficult to dismiss. In the end, the anonymity does more than obscure identity. It forces the reader to confront an uncomfortable possibility. If the author cannot be named, then the responsibility cannot be contained. The notebook stops being the product of one individual and becomes evidence of a system, a culture, and a moment in history that allowed such work to occur without protest. The author disappears into the background, leaving behind only their actions, preserved in ink, waiting to be judged by a future they never anticipated. What emerges most disturbingly from the notebook is not a single shocking act, but a pattern, a methodical reduction of human lives into abstract entries. Page after page, individuals are stripped of identity and replaced with numbers, measurements, and shorthand observations. Names, when they exist at all, are abbreviated or omitted entirely. In their place are classifications: age, gender, diagnosis, perceived temperament. The effect is chilling. These were not people to the author, they were cases. The numbering system itself reveals intent. Subjects are logged sequentially, as if part of an ongoing series rather than unique encounters. This implies continuity, long-term access, and an expectation of repetition. The same types of individuals appear again and again, suggesting that certain populations were considered especially suitable for observation. Women diagnosed with hysteria. Men labeled as morally unstable. Children described as developmentally deficient. These categories were not accidental. They reflected the biases of the time and the quiet hierarchies that govern medical care. For women, the notebook's language is particularly revealing. Emotional expression, resistance, or distress is frequently interpreted as pathology rather than reaction. A raised voice becomes agitation. Fear becomes instability. Physical pain is rarely acknowledged as such. Instead, it is reframed as exaggerated perception. The author's notes imply that women's bodies and minds were especially prone to dysfunction, reinforcing prevailing beliefs that justified invasive interventions. There is no recognition of the social pressures these women faced, only a fixation on their supposed defects. Children appear in the notebook with an even greater sense of detachment. They are described almost entirely in terms of potential, usually negative. Family histories are scrutinized for signs of weakness, alcoholism, or mental illness, as if the child's fate were already sealed by blood. Their behaviors are observed not with curiosity or care, but with an eye toward prediction. Would this child become a burden? A criminal? A drain on society? The notebook treats childhood not as a stage of growth, but as an early warning system. Male patients, particularly those connected to crime or institutionalization, are framed as biological problems rather than social ones. Aggression, defiance, or withdrawal are all interpreted through the lens of degeneracy. The possibility that environment, poverty, or trauma played a role is rarely entertained. Instead, the body becomes the culprit. Musculature, skull shape, reflexes, and responsiveness are all meticulously recorded, as if violence itself could be measured and neutralized through anatomy. What is most striking is how little the author seems to need cooperation. Resistance is noted, but it rarely alters the course of action. Subjects who refuse are labeled uncooperative, their reactions used as further evidence of pathology. In this logic, refusal itself becomes a symptom. The notebook does not record attempts to explain procedures or seek understanding. Authority is assumed. Compliance is expected. And when it is not given, it is simply overridden. The emotional reality of these patients is almost entirely absent, yet it lingers between the lines. A sudden spike in pulse. A loss of responsiveness. A deterioration noted without explanation. These clinical markers hint at fear, pain, and exhaustion, even if the author never names them. The silence around suffering becomes its own form of testimony. The notebook does not need to describe screams to confirm that they occurred. The structure of the entries reinforces this dehumanization. Each subject is reduced to a sequence: observation, intervention, result. There is no before and no after. Lives begin and end within the margins of the page. Once a case concludes, whether through discharge, transfer, or death, the notebook moves on. There is no reflection on long-term consequences, no acknowledgement that these individuals existed beyond their usefulness to the study. This approach was not unique to one doctor. It reflected a broader medical culture that valued detachment as a virtue. Emotional distance was seen as necessary to objectivity. Compassion, when it interfered with observation, was considered a liability. The Notebook embodies this philosophy taken to its extreme, where empathy is not just absent but systematically excluded. Social class plays a quiet but decisive role in who appears within these pages. The well-connected, the wealthy, the respected, these are conspicuously absent. Instead, the subjects are those whose voices carried little weight: institutionalized patients, the poor, the socially deviant. Their presence in the Notebook is evidence of an unspoken agreement between medicine and society. Progress would be built on those least able to refuse it. There is also a sense of inevitability in how cases unfold. Once a subject is categorized, their trajectory seems predetermined. Improvements are noted cautiously, often attributed to external factors or dismissed as temporary. Declines are framed as confirmation of initial diagnosis. The Notebook becomes a closed system, where outcomes always validate the author's assumptions. In such a system, the patient can never truly win. Occasionally, the Notebook hints at moments of discomfort, entries where outcomes deviate unexpectedly, where reactions cannot be easily explained. These moments are rare, and when they occur, the author responds by increasing scrutiny rather than questioning the framework itself. Anomalies are treated as challenges to be overcome, not warnings to stop. The cumulative effect of these pages is overwhelming. Individually, each entry might appear unremarkable, even routine by the standards of the time. Together, they form a portrait of systematic dehumanization. This was not a single lapse in judgment, but a sustained way of seeing the world. A worldview in which people became raw material. What makes this realization so disturbing is how easily it fits within the historical context. The Notebook does not depict a rogue experimenter operating in secret basements. It reflects practices that occurred in daylight, under institutional roofs, supported by prevailing beliefs. The patients were not hidden because their suffering was unique, but because it was inconvenient. In reducing people to case numbers, the Notebook achieves something far more lasting than data collection. It exposes the fragile line between care and control, between healing and harm. It forces us to confront how quickly empathy can be stripped away when authority goes unchallenged. And it reminds us that the most enduring atrocities are often committed not in moments of rage, but in quiet rooms, recorded carefully, one number at a time. As the Notebook progresses, the tone subtly shifts. The observations become more intrusive, the interventions more deliberate, and the consequences more severe. What began as documentation slowly transforms into experimentation. Not in the dramatic sense of sudden cruelty, but in the quiet, incremental way that boundaries erode when they are never clearly defined. Each new procedure builds upon the last, justified by curiosity, necessity, or the promise of understanding something no one else has yet grasped. The experiments described are not always spelled out in graphic detail, but the implications are unmistakable. There are repeated references to neurological stimulation, to induce states of confusion or agitation, to the deliberate withholding or introduction of substances whose effects were poorly understood at the time. Electrotherapy appears frequently, described with clinical neutrality. Currents are adjusted. Responses are measured. Discomfort is noted only when it interferes with observation. Pain, unless catastrophic, is rarely acknowledged as a factor in its own right. Sedatives and chemical compounds are administered in varying doses, sometimes altered mid-course based on reaction. The language suggests trial and error rather than established protocol. Terms like insufficient response and unexpected deterioration recur, hinting at substances pushed beyond safe limits. In some cases, reactions are severe: loss of motor control, prolonged unconsciousness, sudden psychological changes. These outcomes are recorded as data points, not as warnings. Sensory deprivation and overstimulation are also implied. Subjects are isolated, exposed to prolonged silence or repetitive stimuli, and then observed for changes in behavior. When agitation increases, it is framed as diagnostic confirmation rather than distress. The Notebook reflects a belief that extreme conditions reveal truth, that by pushing the mind to its limits, its underlying structure could be exposed. The possibility that such methods might cause lasting harm is never directly addressed. What is particularly troubling is the lack of distinction between treatment and experiment. Procedures are justified as therapeutic even when their experimental nature is obvious. This dual framing provides cover. If an intervention fails, It was simply an unsuccessful treatment. If it yields interesting results, it becomes a valuable experiment. The patient, meanwhile, bears the full risk in both scenarios. There are entries that suggest repeated interventions on the same subjects. Adjustments are made based on previous responses, as if refining a technique rather than caring for a person. This repetition implies a disregard for cumulative harm. Each session is treated as an isolated event, its impact measured only in immediate outcomes. Long-term consequences remain unexamined, perhaps intentionally. Physical invasiveness increases as the notebook continues. There are references to probing reflexes, applying pressure, manipulating limbs, and testing pain thresholds. These acts are described in technical terms that obscure their brutality. The body becomes a site of inquiry, something to be tested and mapped. The subject's experience of violation is absent from the record, replaced by mechanical descriptions of response. Psychological stress is not avoided. It is often induced. Subjects are confronted with contradictions, denied explanations, or subjected to unpredictable routines. The resulting anxiety, confusion, or withdrawal is catalogued as symptomatic. In this way, the experiment creates the very behaviors it claims to study. The notebook does not acknowledge this feedback loop. To do so would require questioning the legitimacy of the findings. Deaths, when they occur, are handled with unsettling brevity. In some cases, the cause is implied rather than stated. A sudden decline following an intervention. A failure to regain consciousness. An unrecoverable state. The absence of reflection suggests that death was not an unexpected outcome, but a known risk. One that the author appears to have accepted as part of the process. What is most striking is the confidence with which these experiments are conducted. There is no sense of improvisation born from uncertainty. Instead, the notebook conveys a belief in eventual success, that even failed attempts contribute to a larger understanding. This belief insulates the author from moral reckoning. If knowledge accumulates, then no single loss matters. The scientific context of the time provides some explanation, but not absolution. The late 19th century was a period of intense experimentation, particularly in neurology and psychiatry. Ethical guidelines were vague, and oversight minimal. Innovation was prized, often at the expense of caution. Yet even by the standards of the era, the notebook suggests a willingness to push beyond accepted limits. The secrecy alone implies that the author knew these methods would not withstand scrutiny. There is also an undercurrent of competition in the writing. The drive to discover, to be first, to see what others have not yet dared to test. This ambition fuels risk-taking. It encourages escalation. Each successful intervention raises the stakes, inviting more extreme trials. Failure does not lead to retreat, but to refinement. The absence of patient voices is perhaps the most damning aspect of these experiments. We do not hear fear, confusion, or resistance, only reactions measured from the outside. This silence is not accidental. It is the result of a worldview that places observation above experience. In such a framework, suffering becomes irrelevant unless it disrupts data collection. Reading these entries now, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what was done in the name of progress. The experiments described may lack the dramatic cruelty associated with later atrocities, but they are no less disturbing for their restraint. They represent a form of violence that is slow, methodical, and justified by intellect. The notebook captures a moment when medicine stood at a crossroads, uncertain of how far it was willing to go. The author chose a path that prioritized knowledge over humanity, precision over compassion. And while the experiments may have contributed to understanding in ways that are difficult to measure, they also left behind a record of harm that cannot be undone. What remains is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous experiments are not always those conducted in secret laboratories, but those carried out under the banner of legitimacy. When authority goes unquestioned and ethics are treated as obstacles rather than safeguards, the line between healing and harm disappears. The notebook does not merely document experiments, it reveals how easily science can lose its soul when it forgets the people it is meant to serve. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of the notebook is not what it records, but how it records it. The language is calm, precise, almost elegant in its structure. Sentences are short and functional. Words are chosen for efficiency, not expression. At first glance, it reads like any other scientific document of its era, measured, restrained, authoritative. But this restraint is not neutrality. It is a tool. And in this notebook, Language becomes the primary instrument of dehumanization. Suffering rarely appears as suffering. Pain is translated into heightened response. Fear becomes agitation. Despair is reduced to emotional instability. The vocabulary strips experiences of their emotional reality and replaces them with terminology that sounds manageable, even routine. This transformation is not accidental. By renaming distress, the author renders it acceptable. Once pain is converted into data, it no longer demands moral attention. Latin terminology plays a crucial role. Diagnoses and bodily reactions are often recorded in Latin or technical shorthand, placing distance between the act and its meaning. Latin carries authority. It signals education, tradition, and legitimacy. But it also obscures. A phrase that might sound alarming in plain language becomes neutral when wrapped in classical terms. This linguistic barrier protects the writer, not just from criticism, but from empathy. The passive voice dominates the notebook. Things are done, but rarely by anyone. Subject restrained. Procedure initiated. Response observed. The absence of an active agent subtly erases responsibility. No one harms the subject. Harm simply occurs. This grammatical choice allows the author to disappear from their own actions, reinforcing the illusion of objectivity. Events unfold as if governed by natural law rather than human decision. Even death is linguistically softened. Subjects do not die, they expire, fail to recover, or reach an irreversible state. These phrases drain finality of its emotional weight. Death becomes a technical outcome rather than a human catastrophe. The notebook does not pause at these moments. There is no shift in tone, no indication that something irreversible has occurred. The language moves forward, indifferent, as if nothing of significance has been lost. Numbers further replace identity. Subjects are referred to by case numbers or descriptors that reduce them to variables. Once assigned, these identifiers become permanent. A person's entire existence within the notebook is contained within a sequence of digits and symptoms. Numbers do not age. They do not suffer. They do not protest. By converting people into numerical entries, the author ensures that emotional engagement remains unnecessary. This linguistic distancing serves a psychological function. It allows the writer to observe without feeling, to act without confronting consequence. Language becomes armor. Each technical term, each euphemism, each grammatical evasion adds another layer of protection between the author and the reality of what is being done. Over time, this protection becomes self-reinforcing. The more detached the language, the easier it becomes to continue. What makes this particularly disturbing is how familiar it feels. This style of writing did not disappear with the 19th century. It persists in modern bureaucracies, legal documents, and institutional reports. The notebook reveals an early version of a pattern that would later define some of history's darkest chapters, the systematic use of language to make cruelty appear reasonable. There are moments in the notebook where emotional language almost breaks through. A phrase is crossed out. A word softened. These revisions suggest that the author was aware, at least on some level, of how language could expose intent. The act of editing becomes a moral act, not to reduce harm, but to conceal it more effectively. The final version is always cleaner, colder, safer. The language also reinforces hierarchy. The author's voice is confident, authoritative, unquestioned. Subjects never speak in their own words. Their reactions are interpreted, summarized, filtered. This imbalance mirrors the power dynamic of the institution itself. The one who names controls reality. Once a behavior is labeled pathological, it ceases to be a response and becomes a flaw. Once a person is defined as defective, intervention becomes justified. Terms related to morality and biology blur together in unsettling ways. Words like degenerate, inferior, and unstable appear alongside anatomical descriptions, suggesting that moral judgment is inseparable from physical condition. This fusion allows social prejudice to masquerade as scientific observation. Language does the work of ideology quietly, efficiently, without the need for overt declarations. The notebook structure amplifies this effect. Each entry follows a predictable format, reinforcing the sense that what is being described is normal, expected, routine. Repetition dulls sensitivity. When the same euphemisms appear again and again, they lose their ability to shock. What might initially provoke discomfort becomes standard procedure. Language trains both writer and reader to accept what would otherwise be intolerable. This normalization is perhaps the most dangerous outcome of dehumanizing language. Once cruelty is routine, it no longer feels like cruelty. It becomes process, system, method. The Notebook does not contain moments of dramatic evil. It contains countless small acts of indifference, each made easier by the words used to describe them. Reading the Notebook today requires active resistance. One must translate the language back into human terms to grasp its true meaning. Subject unresponsive becomes a person slipping into unconsciousness. Behavior deteriorated becomes someone breaking under pressure. Irreversible state becomes death. Without this translation, the Notebook risks continuing its work, masking harm beneath professionalism. The author likely believed that this language was necessary. That emotion would contaminate observation. That clarity required distance. But the Notebook demonstrates the cost of that belief. When language is stripped of empathy, it no longer describes reality, it reshapes it. It creates a world where suffering is invisible, where responsibility dissolves, and where harm can proceed unchecked. The true horror of the Notebook is not found in a single word or phrase, but in the system of language it constructs. A system where people become objects, actions become events, and consequences become footnotes. This is how atrocities begin, not with violence, but with vocabulary. And once that vocabulary takes hold, it becomes remarkably difficult to speak against it. The Notebook's language reminds us that ethics do not fail all at once. They erode, quietly, sentence by sentence. When words lose their connection to human experience, cruelty no longer needs justification. It only needs documentation. Running beneath the clinical observations and experimental notes is a deeper current of belief, one that gives the Notebook its ideological gravity. Again and again, the author returns to questions of inheritance, of bloodlines, traits, and invisible flaws passed silently from one generation to the next. Illness is rarely treated as an isolated event. Instead, it is framed as evidence of something older, something embedded, something that precedes the individual entirely. In this worldview, the patient is not merely sick, they are the expression of a lineage gone wrong. The late 19th century was obsessed with heredity. Long before genetics became a formal science, doctors and thinkers were convinced that character, intelligence, morality, and disease were transmitted through families like a hidden code. Zurich, with its thriving academic culture, was deeply influenced by these ideas. The Notebook reflects this influence with disturbing clarity. Family histories are dissected relentlessly. Alcoholism, criminality, mental illness, poverty, all are treated as interchangeable markers of biological failure. What is striking is how quickly correlation becomes certainty. A parent's behavior is used to explain a child's condition. A distant relative's institutionalization is invoked as proof of inevitable decline. Environmental factors are mentioned only in passing, if at all. The complexity of human development is flattened into a single narrative. Degeneration begets degeneration. Once this conclusion is reached, intervention is no longer about healing, it is about containment. The author appears fascinated by the idea of purity, though it is never explicitly named as such. There is an underlying assumption that society functions best when certain traits dominate and others are controlled or eliminated. This belief does not announce itself loudly. It is woven into the logic of observation. Patients deemed inferior are scrutinized more aggressively. Their failures are documented with particular interest. Their suffering becomes evidence, not tragedy. These ideas did not exist on the fringe. They circulated openly in medical journals, lectures, and conferences across Europe. Degeneration theory suggested that modern society, rather than improving humanity, was accelerating its decline by allowing the unfit to survive and reproduce. Medicine, in this framework, became a corrective force, not just treating illness, but managing the future of the population. The Notebook is a private manifestation of this public anxiety. The most chilling aspect is how these theories justify everything that follows. If a patient is biologically doomed, then their pain becomes irrelevant. If decline is inevitable, then experimentation is merely documentation. The Notebook treats certain individuals as already lost, their bodies repurposed as sites of learning. The author does not express cruelty toward them, they express resignation. And resignation, when paired with authority, can be devastating. Children are central to this logic. They represent the future, and therefore the greatest threat. The notebook's focus on childhood symptoms is not compassionate, it is predictive. Small irregularities are magnified into signs of permanent defect. Behavior that might otherwise be dismissed as developmental variation is interpreted as early warning. The implication is clear: intervention must occur early, before degeneration spreads. Women, particularly mothers, are also framed through this lens. Their bodies become vessels of transmission, their behavior scrutinized for signs of moral or biological weakness. A woman's illness is rarely confined to her alone. It is projected forward, imagined as a risk to offspring and society at large. This framing strips women of individuality and autonomy, reducing them to conduits of heredity. The notebook's fixation on bloodlines creates a closed moral universe. Once a family is labeled defective, every member becomes suspect. Improvement is temporary. Decline is permanent. This rigidity leaves no room for redemption or complexity. It is a worldview that thrives on certainty, even when that certainty is built on speculation. What makes this especially dangerous is how seamlessly ideology merges with observation. The author does not present their beliefs as opinions. They are embedded in the structure of the notes themselves. Which patients are chosen? Which details are emphasized? Which outcomes are considered significant? The notebook does not argue for degeneration theory, it assumes it. And in doing so, it transforms theory into practice. There is a quiet but unmistakable shift in tone when hereditary explanations appear. The writing becomes more confident, more definitive. Ambiguity disappears. Where symptoms alone might invite caution, heredity provides closure. A narrative is complete once lineage is invoked. The patient's fate feels sealed, and the author's role becomes observational rather than responsible. This logic also protects the author from doubt. If outcomes are predetermined by biology, then failures cannot be attributed to methods. Death does not signal error, it confirms diagnosis. The notebook thus becomes self-validating. Every result reinforces the belief system that produced it. In hindsight, these ideas are deeply unsettling not only because of what they led to, but because of how reasonable they once seemed. Degeneration theory offered simple explanations for complex social problems. Crime, poverty, mental illness, all could be blamed on biology rather than inequality or trauma. Medicine was relieved of the burden of compassion and tasked instead with management. The notebook stands at an early point in a trajectory that would later produce far more explicit doctrines of eugenics. It does not call for sterilization or extermination. It does not need to. It performs a quieter function, laying the intellectual groundwork. By categorizing, documenting, and pathologizing, it normalizes the idea that some lives are inherently less valuable than others. There are moments where the author's certainty borders on obsession. Patterns are sought aggressively, even when evidence is thin. Coincidences are elevated to proof. The desire to map human worth onto biology becomes almost compulsive. This is not the detachment of a neutral observer, but the focus of someone deeply invested in a particular vision of order. What is most disturbing is how little resistance this worldview appears to encounter. The notebook suggests no internal debate, no external challenge. These ideas flow unimpeded, absorbed into daily practice. This silence speaks volumes. It reveals a professional culture that rewarded conformity to prevailing theories and discouraged ethical dissent. The legacy of these beliefs extends far beyond the notebook itself. They shaped policies, institutions, and attitudes well into the 20th century. Reading the notebook now feels like witnessing the early stages of a moral collapse that history would later recognize in far more extreme forms. The language is gentler. The methods are quieter. But the logic is unmistakable. In the end, the notebook's fixation on heredity exposes a profound failure of imagination. It reduces human life to inheritance, ignoring resilience, context, and change. It replaces curiosity with judgment and care with control. And in doing so, it transforms medicine from a healing practice into an instrument of exclusion. The notebook does not shout its ideology. It whispers it, patiently, line by line. And that whisper, preserved on the page, is perhaps more dangerous than any overt declaration, because it sounds, even now, like reason. At some point, the notebook disappears from view. Not in a dramatic sense. There is no recorded scandal, no public accusation, no official investigation tied directly to its contents. Instead, it fades quietly into obscurity, which in many ways is far more revealing. In institutions built on reputation, Silence is often the most deliberate act of all. Medical establishments at the turn of the 20th century understood the power of documentation. Official records were carefully maintained, curated, and preserved in ways that reinforced legitimacy. What did not serve that purpose could be sidelined, misfiled, or quietly removed. The notebook, with its private tone and ethically questionable content, did not belong in public archives. It was never meant to represent the institution. It represented something else entirely, the shadow side of progress. There are subtle signs that the notebook's disappearance was intentional rather than accidental. Its format does not match standard hospital ledgers. It lacks indexing, formal headers, and institutional stamps. This suggests it was never meant to be integrated into official systems. It existed parallel to them, benefiting from institutional access while avoiding institutional accountability. When its usefulness ended, or when its risk became apparent, it could be removed without disrupting official narratives. Reputation was everything. Zurich's medical community was competing with other European centers for prestige, funding, and influence. Scandals threatened not just individuals, but entire schools of thought. To expose unethical experimentation would invite scrutiny not only of one doctor, but of the structures that enabled them. Silence protected everyone involved, from senior administrators to junior researchers who followed orders without question. There is also the question of legal vulnerability. Even in an era with weak patient protections, overt evidence of harm carried risks. Families might ask questions. Authorities might intervene. A notebook that documented repeated invasive procedures, unexplained deaths, or clear experimentation could become dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The simplest solution was to ensure it never did. The culture of medicine at the time encouraged this kind of quiet containment. Problems were handled internally. Errors were reframed as unfortunate necessities. Ethical discomfort was managed through discretion rather than reform. The notebook's fate fits this pattern perfectly. It was not destroyed. Destruction leaves traces, raises suspicion. It was simply set aside, allowed to become invisible. Who made that decision remains unknown. It may have been the author themselves, sensing that their work had crossed an unspoken line. The abrupt end of the entries supports this possibility. There is no gradual winding down, no concluding remarks. The writing simply stops. This could indicate interruption, a transfer, illness, or removal from position. Or it could reflect a conscious choice to stop documenting what could no longer be safely recorded. It is also possible that others were aware of the notebook's existence. Senior physicians often exercise quiet oversight, even if they did not intervene directly. They may have tolerated experimental excesses as long as they remained discreet. Once documentation threatened to outlive usefulness, intervention became necessary. A word in a hallway. A warning. A suggestion to be more careful. Such moments rarely leave records. What makes the notebook's disappearance especially telling is how common this practice was. Medical history is full of gaps, experiments hinted at but not fully documented, outcomes summarized but not explained, archives that skip inconvenient years. These absences are not accidents. They are the result of deliberate choices about what history should remember. The notebook, in this sense, was not hidden because it was unique. It was hidden because it was too honest. It recorded actions that were understood, on some level, to be unacceptable if examined too closely. It lacked the protective language of publication, the framing of success and contribution. It was raw, procedural, and indifferent to moral narrative. That made it dangerous. There is also an element of collective denial at play. Institutions often convince themselves that what occurred in the past is irrelevant to the present. By burying documents like this notebook, they create a clean break, a myth of ethical continuity. The past becomes sanitized, its darker elements erased in favor of a story of steady improvement. The notebook threatened that story. The mechanics of its concealment were likely mundane. A mislabeled box. An archive shelf few visited. A personal collection passed down without scrutiny. These small acts of neglect are powerful. They allow institutions to claim ignorance while benefiting from silence. Over time, neglect becomes erasure. Yet complete erasure rarely succeeds. Paper survives. Ink endures. What is hidden can always be found again. The notebook's eventual rediscovery suggests that it was never meant to be destroyed, only postponed. Its survival hints at ambivalence, a reluctance to fully confront what it represented, but also an inability to completely eliminate it. The decision to hide rather than destroy may reflect a deeper conflict within the medical community. Even as ethical concerns grew, there was recognition that these experiments contributed to knowledge. To destroy the notebook would be to deny that contribution. To preserve it openly would be to invite condemnation. Hiding it allowed both truths to coexist uncomfortably. This limbo mirrors how societies often deal with morally troubling achievements. We benefit from them while distancing ourselves from their origins. The notebook was inconvenient because it forced a choice between acknowledgement and denial. Hiding it postponed that choice indefinitely. The passage of time did the rest. As generations changed, institutional memory faded. Those who might have known the notebook's significance retired or died. What began as deliberate concealment slowly became genuine ignorance. By the time it resurfaced, it belonged to a different world, one with new ethical standards and new questions. Yet the fact that it was hidden at all remains crucial. It tells us that even in 1899, there were boundaries, lines that could be crossed, but not openly acknowledged. The notebook's secrecy is proof that its contents were understood, at least intuitively, to be wrong. Not wrong enough to stop, perhaps, but wrong enough to hide. In that sense, the notebook's concealment is as revealing as its contents. It exposes the gap between what institutions do and what they are willing to admit. It shows how easily accountability can be deferred, not through overt conspiracy, but through quiet consensus. No single person needs to say, "This must never be seen." Everyone simply behaves as if that were already understood. The notebook waited in silence while medicine advanced, reformed, and rebranded itself. New ethical codes were written. New safeguards were introduced. The past was declared resolved. And yet, beneath that narrative, the notebook remained, a reminder that progress often carries unresolved debts. When it finally re-emerged, it did so not as a scandal, but as a question. Not just about one doctor or one institution, but about how history is curated. About what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. The notebook was hidden because it threatened comfort. Its rediscovery threatens complacency. And perhaps that is why it still matters. Not because it reveals something entirely new, but because it confirms something deeply uncomfortable, that the most disturbing truths are rarely destroyed. They are simply set aside, waiting for a moment when someone is willing to look. When the notebook finally resurfaced, it did not arrive with ceremony. There was no dramatic announcement, no immediate recognition of its weight. Its rediscovery was quiet, almost accidental, the result of routine archival work rather than deliberate investigation. Boxes were being reorganized, collections reassessed, materials catalogued according to modern standards. In that slow, methodical process, the notebook reappeared, out of place, unremarkable in appearance, yet unmistakably different once opened. At first, it was treated as a curiosity. Archivists are accustomed to encountering personal notes, marginalia, and incomplete records from earlier eras. Many such documents offer little more than context or color. But as pages were turned and the content became clearer, unease set in. The handwriting was too consistent, the entries too systematic, the subject matter too deliberate to dismiss as idle notes. This was not a forgotten student exercise or a private journal. It was evidence. Modern readers immediately noticed what earlier generations had ignored or chosen not to see. The absence of consent. The experimental tone disguised as treatment. The repeated harm framed as observation. What once blended seamlessly into the medical culture of 1899 now stood out sharply against contemporary ethical standards. The notebook felt alien and familiar at the same time, foreign in its assumptions, yet disturbingly close in its language. Historians brought in to assess the document struggled with how to classify it. It did not fit neatly into existing categories. It was not an official institutional record, yet it clearly documented institutional practices. It was not intended for publication, yet it reflected prevailing theories of its time. This ambiguity made it powerful. It could not be dismissed as an outlier, nor could it be comfortably integrated into sanitized narratives of medical progress. As excerpts circulated among scholars, reactions were mixed but intense. Some focused on its historical value, emphasizing the need to understand the context rather than judge it by modern standards. Others found that argument insufficient. Context, they argued, explains behavior but does not excuse it. The notebook forced a confrontation between historical relativism and moral accountability, a tension that remains unresolved in many fields. Medical ethicists were particularly unsettled. To them, the notebook represented a case study in how easily professional norms can drift when oversight is weak and authority is concentrated. They noted how familiar the justification sounded: advancement of knowledge, benefit to future patients, inevitability of risk. These rationales had not disappeared. They had merely been reframed over time. The notebook exposed their origins in stark relief. There was debate over how publicly the document should be discussed. Some institutions feared that highlighting it would invite criticism not just of the past, but of present practices. Others argued that transparency was essential, that confronting uncomfortable history was a necessary step toward ethical maturity. This debate echoed the very dynamics that had allowed the notebook to be hidden in the first place. When details of the notebook reached a broader audience, reactions shifted again. Outside academic circles, the language felt cold, almost inhuman. Readers unfamiliar with medical jargon struggled to reconcile the calm tone with the implied suffering. The gap between how events were described and what they likely felt like created a sense of horror that no dramatic embellishment could match. The restraint of the writing became its most disturbing feature. For many, the notebook shattered the illusion that unethical medical practices were confined to distant places or extreme regimes. Zurich, associated with neutrality, precision, and humanistic values, did not fit the popular image of medical abuse. The notebook forced a re-evaluation of where harm can occur. It demonstrated that ethical failure does not require chaos or cruelty, only complacency. Some attempted to frame the notebook as an artifact of ignorance, arguing that doctors simply did not know better. But this interpretation faltered under scrutiny. The very fact that the notebook was hidden suggested awareness. The careful language, the private format, the lack of official endorsement, all pointed to an understanding that these practices existed in a grey zone. Ignorance alone does not produce secrecy. Others saw the notebook as a warning rather than an indictment. They argued that its value lay not in condemning past actors, but in illuminating patterns that persist. The tendency to prioritize data over dignity. The ease with which marginalized populations become test subjects. The comfort institutions find in silence. These patterns did not vanish with new codes of ethics. They simply evolved. The rediscovery also raised questions about responsibility. Who owns the past? Does an institution bear moral accountability for actions taken under earlier standards? Can acknowledgement coexist with pride in progress? The notebook offered no easy answers. It sat uneasily between condemnation and contribution, forcing readers to grapple with complexity rather than certainty. There were calls to contextualize the notebook publicly, to include it in exhibitions or educational programs. Some supported this, seeing it as an opportunity for reflection. Others worried about misinterpretation, sensationalism, or damage to reputations. Once again, the instinct to protect institutional image clashed with the imperative to tell the truth. What ultimately distinguished the notebook's rediscovery from its initial concealment was the shift in moral climate. Where once silence felt protective, it now felt complicit. The very standards that made the notebook shocking also made it impossible to ignore. Modern ethics demanded engagement, even if that engagement was uncomfortable. For many who encountered the notebook, the most unsettling realization was not what had been done, but how ordinary it seemed. The entries lacked drama. The procedures were incremental. The harm accumulated slowly. This ordinariness challenged the idea that ethical disasters announce themselves clearly. Instead, they unfold quietly, normalized through routine. The notebook's return to visibility disrupted a long-standing narrative of linear progress. It reminded readers that advancement is uneven, that gains in knowledge can coexist with losses in humanity. It forced a reckoning with the cost of discovery and the ease with which that cost is forgotten once benefits are secured. In the end, the rediscovery did not provide closure. It did not resolve debates or offer redemption. What it did was reopen a conversation that had been deferred for more than a century. A conversation about power, responsibility, and the human consequences of curiosity. The notebook emerged into a world that could finally see it for what it was, not an anomaly, not a relic of barbarism, but a mirror held up to the process of progress itself. And in that reflection, many recognized something deeply unsettling. The past was not as distant as they had believed, and the questions it raised were far from settled. The notebook does not end with its rediscovery. Its most unsettling impact lies in what it reveals about the present. Once the initial shock fades, a more uncomfortable question emerges: how much has truly changed? Modern medicine prides itself on ethics committees, informed consent, and patient rights, yet the logic that underpinned the Notebook has never fully disappeared. It has merely become more sophisticated, more carefully managed, and more convincingly justified. Throughout the 20th century, medical history repeatedly echoed the same patterns seen in Zurich in 1899. Unethical experiments justified by urgency. Marginalized populations framed as suitable subjects because their voices carried less weight. Language designed to neutralize harm. Each scandal was followed by reform, and each reform was followed by reassurance that such things could never happen again. And yet, they did. The Notebook forces us to confront the uncomfortable continuity between past and present. The idea that knowledge gained through suffering can be morally redeemed did not die with degeneration theory. It reappeared in different forms: clinical trials conducted without full transparency, experimental treatments pushed on desperate patients, data collected under conditions where refusal was theoretically possible but practically unimaginable. The mechanisms change. The imbalance of power remains. What has evolved most effectively is language. Modern terminology is even more precise, more regulated, more legally insulated. Harm becomes adverse outcome. Risk becomes acceptable margin. Responsibility is distributed across committees, protocols, and institutions until it becomes difficult to locate it all. The Notebook's blunt phrasing has been replaced, but its function survives. Language still protects systems from confronting the human cost of their decisions. Technology has amplified this risk. Advanced imaging, genetic profiling, and predictive algorithms promise unprecedented insight into the human body and mind. But they also revive old questions under new guises. When does prediction become judgment? When does prevention become control? The Notebook's fixation on heredity feels uncomfortably familiar in an age of genetic risk scores and behavioral forecasting. The temptation to reduce individuals to probabilities remains strong. There is also the enduring problem of invisibility. Even today, medical harm is unevenly distributed. Those with wealth, education, and social power are better positioned to question authority. Those without are more likely to be studied, monitored, and experimented upon. The Notebook reminds us that ethical safeguards are only as strong as the voices allowed to challenge them. Perhaps the most troubling lesson is how ordinary the process looks in retrospect. The Notebook did not record moments of moral crisis. It documented routine. And routine is where ethical failure thrives. When harmful practices are embedded in daily work, they no longer feel harmful. They feel necessary, efficient, justified. The legacy of the Notebook is not a warning about monstrous individuals, but about systems that reward detachment and discourage reflection. It shows how easily good intentions can coexist with devastating consequences when outcomes are valued more than experiences. When success is measured in results rather than responsibility. Modern medicine often frames itself as having learned from the past. In many ways, it has. But learning is not the same as immunity. The conditions that allowed the Notebook to exist, ambition, hierarchy, faith in progress, trust in authority, still shape scientific culture. Without constant vigilance, they can produce the same results, even under new ethical banners. The Notebook endures because it exposes a flaw that cannot be fixed by rules alone. Ethics is not just a framework, it is a practice. It requires discomfort, resistance, and the willingness to slow down when progress demands speed. The Notebook shows what happens when that willingness is absent. In confronting it, we are forced to abandon the comforting belief that cruelty is obvious and easily avoided. More often, it is quiet, procedural, and rationalized. It hides in plain sight, recorded carefully, defended intelligently, and forgotten conveniently. The true relevance of the Notebook lies here, not as a relic of a darker age, but as a reminder that the line between healing and harm is never fixed. It must be redrawn, again and again, by those willing to see patients not as data points, but as human beings whose lives matter beyond the knowledge they might provide.